conference. And I guess my co-chairs should join me now so that we can transition to our panel discussion, which will be the final crowning of Timbre 2020. I think Kai is going to take over now.
Yes, so thanks Harris, and thanks David again. I think we are still waiting for Nathalie and Philippe to join. But,
no, I'm here. Sorry, I am here.
Hi Philippe. So we're all there, that's good. Yeah, so now we proceed with the panel discussion, basically after 2 days full of interesting insights and discussion. We've really heard a lot of different approaches to timbre research. Today, for example, ranging from discussions about invariant neurons in the auditory cortex, then touching on salience of timbral cues, question of timbral logic, Klangfarbenmelodie and syntax, up to tonight's keynote on the interaction of pitch and timbre in choral music. And yesterday we've heard about timbre and musical tension and affect. We heard about timbral semantics in very different domains, synthesizer sounds on the one hand, bird calls on the other hand. And then towards the end of the day, we heard about timbre and instruments and musical acoustics. I think besides these scientific issues, I think what's also really important is that we as a community here have come together and shown that it's possible, even in these crazy times, to gather and to interact. Using Zoom during the Q&A, during speed dating, using GatherTown, and I think that was a lot of fun too and very gratifying. So to use Stephen McAdams' formulation from 2 years ago, the goddess of timbre is smiling upon us with her 13 disciplinary heads and myriad ears. So yeah, I guess in this panel discussion, we just want to take our time to gather around our virtual fireplace and have a discussion about, and just a simple conversation about issues revolving around these 13 heads of timbre. And of course, as we can see here in Zoom, we have lots of expertise in the audience as well. So all participants are invited to contribute to the discussion, of course, just by using raise hands as we did, or use the chat, and we'll get you on stage. So now let me briefly introduce our panelists. We have Nathalie Herold, who's a musicologist and researcher at the University of Strasbourg. We have Gary Bromham, who is an accomplished music producer and now researcher as well at the C4DM in London. And we have Philippe Esling, who's associate professor in data mining and artificial intelligence at IRCAM and head of the ACIDS research group at IRCAM. So thanks for joining our panel discussion, all of you. The first thing to ask, I guess, dear panelists, whether there's anything that you wish to comment on instantly, perhaps any impressions of this first online conference on timbre, along the lines of how much we are all missing physical conferences, or perhaps we're not missing physical conference at all. Perhaps you wish to comment on that.
I am missing Greece for sure. But apart from that, I guess that, you know, that's interesting how human minds can adapt. And basically, I'm pretty sure we can get some very interesting ideas going on without having physical relationships. But yeah, for me, it's also a good place, at least in terms of, you know, audio research and all these questions, that's how we can also empower research across different countries, even though we have to stay at the same place. So I don't know if other people have ideas. I'm actually trying to develop new pedagogical means for artificial intelligence research, and I would be very interested to, you know, kind of keep this idea going on, because lots of people, I mean, it also reflects on this other idea that knowledge is sometimes hard to reach for some people. So for me, it's an interesting experiment somehow. But yeah, it's more of a meta question, so I don't want to get lost right away at the beginning of the discussion. So I'm going to stop there.
It saves a lot of money.
Indeed.
I don't think I could get to Greece on my budget right now, or my propensity to even travel. But I was in Thessaloniki in 1997 for I guess it was computer music conference. So it's a great place.
Gary and Nathalie, you were following the conference for the last 2 days, I guess.
Yes, I followed the conference, and I think it was very, very interesting. A lot of people, many participants. I guess 50, 70, 80 participants it would not have been the case, perhaps, if we had a real conference, and lots of people, lots of young researchers, and I think it's a potential for grounding a community that can be very interesting, a community with different expertise fields, very interdisciplinary, and I think it's a potential to create a community. It was important to make this virtual conference, because 2 years ago we met in Montreal, and it was the moment to gather, to exchange ideas on knowledge and so on. So many thanks for that.
Yeah, similarly, for me, first of all, I get my imposter syndrome speech out of the way by saying this is definitely not my field or my area of expertise. Having said that, I've spent 40 years working with sound, and I made many records. And I guess the thing that's come out of this for me is the importance of connecting emotion, semantics with color. I guess my context of timbre is probably color, character. So actually it's really opened my mind up, actually, and introduced me to a lot of new ideas. And going back to the very first keynote where we were talking about, or the talk about tension, and I thought, so people are always asking me semantically, so how do I achieve a certain goal when I'm mixing a record? And they'll often ask me to make something more intimate, or maybe they'll make it more punchy. And it got me to thinking, so how would I add tension to this mix? And I was thinking of dissonance and distortion and all kinds of interesting things, and noise. So yeah, it's been great for me too, actually, and I thank you for this. It's really opened my eyes and my mind, I guess, to many new things. Thank you.
Okay, so I guess that was everybody's intro statement. The next point to discuss, I mean, would be where we see the field moving from here on, right? That's the thing to do, I guess, with beers, that at the end of the conference, that we try to synthesize the insights that we gained during this meeting, and try to look forward. Where are we heading? So perhaps we could reflect on our own field of expertise, starting with the panel, and everybody could say what they think may be exciting developments for the next 10 years or so to come in their own field of expertise.
I guess to direct this discussion a bit. For example, I would like to ask Philippe about, artificial intelligence, and more specifically the field of neural audio synthesis. So what can we learn from that in terms of timbre perception? Like, how can this field inform research and understanding on the perception of timbre?
Wow, you start with a big one. So thank you for the question, even though it's kind of already, tough one. But okay, I'm gonna start with another question, because, when you don't like the question, change it. And basically, I'd say there is something really important going on in the more popular sense of the appreciation of music. And that's really my feeling for what we hear on even, new electronic music and this type of things. It's like pitch is starting to disappear more and more from the electronic and, the young popular music. And it's somehow clear that timbre is now one of the backbone of electronic music composition, for instance. So I'm pretty sure that it's starting to be a central question in everybody's mind. And for me, it's a real, let's say, it's a big question, because we've always been in the fringe of research when talking about timbre, because it was hard to understand and it was a little bit, a concept which was hard to define. And now it's becoming central, even in the popular music sense. So for me, this is a real challenge, where kind of I feel like the popular appreciation of a topic which is not yet very mature. I'm not saying the research on timbre is not mature, but I feel like there is lots of empty spots, and there is so much to do still, but it's starting to be on the spotlight, And for me, it's a very interesting question. Like, the popular appreciation went so fast compared to the research. So it's starting to really explode. I mean, at least that's what I'm sensing. And now to get back to your original question on what is the, let's say, amount of how artificial intelligence can inform these type of questions, mostly on perception. So I'm going to divide this in like 3 questions, let's say, if that's okay. I mean, if someone think I'm saying bullshit, just stop me out. But the first question is what artificial intelligence can bring in terms of timbre. And for me, this is a very, very peculiar question, because there is this dichotomy between imitation and extrapolation, right? So basically, artificial intelligence or machine learning is very good at distribution estimation, which means you have a collection of things and you know well how to map the mean distribution, which means you kind of aim to have a mean error, which is good, which also implies that you kind of stay inside the limits of the collection that you have. And for me, this is a very huge question in how much artificial intelligence is not bound to smooth out the knowledge that we have on timbre, because it's kind of removing the outliers. It's like something I also fear about big data and this type of stuff, because you want to minimize the error across a set of examples. So the problem is, doing that, are you going to remove also the peculiarities and the things that are, specific about some examples inside the set? For me, this is really a huge question when we talk about artificial intelligence and creativity. And now the second aspect is kind of not confusing what we think of perception, because we're talking about intelligence. And every time you talk about intelligence, people think, oh, it's like you know, is it going to replace humans, and this type of, you know, lame questions. And basically, for me, it can be seen as an enhancer, something that will allow to simplify or, okay, I'm going to take a very pragmatic example. I'm talking a lot. I'm sorry about that. Please stop me if I'm talking too much. But I've been working with composers lately, like contemporary composers. And, you know, we're doing these systems where we compress information and we give a very small information space from which you can generate new stuff. So basically, we are trying to take, for instance, all violin sounds and all screaming sounds, and we have only 3 dimensions to explain how these things are behaving. And this makes a synthesizer which has only 3 knobs, right? And so the problem is, when this knob makes too much sense, the composer is not happy, because, yeah, it's like clearly it's centroid, for instance. And when this knob doesn't make any sense, the composer is not happy as well, because it doesn't make any sense. So the problem is, are we able to understand what artificial intelligence or machine learning is going to produce in terms of representation? So for us, we have a clear understanding of some dimensions, and these dimensions are really clear for us. And the point where the algorithm tells us this is a dimension that explains a lot, and this is like the major dimension, but you don't get it. You don't understand what is the perceptual correlate to this dimension, then we start getting lost again. So I think we need to work on this, I'd say instrumental gesture of AI, which means how do we interact with something which is able to organize audio information in a way that we can't really perceive it as a haptic, you know, something we can't get really a grip on. It kind of makes sense, but it's starting to get on the fringe of our own understanding. Sorry, it was a very weird.
I think that was very.
It made much sense. Yeah, thanks. So if I may then take over to direct a question to Nathalie. So Nathalie, I'd like to ask you that, given that a significant portion of the timbre-related research has been lately shifting towards the study of orchestration. So based on that, how do you think that the insight that will be gained and this being gained by this research will inform the field of orchestration pedagogy in the next few years, maybe in 10 or 20 years from now?
Yes, about the relation between timbre and orchestration. For me, it's timbre is closely related to orchestration, because we can say that orchestration, what is it? It is the art of manipulating timbre or of structuring timbre, and it's how to organize timbre in a creative way. It's a way to study timbre creative artifacts. So for me, orchestration is a way to study timbre in musical contexts, and it's a way to consider timbre as a musical material. And we saw during this conference that timbre can have different acceptions, that our definitions or conceptions of timbre are not unified. Maybe, I guess, if I try to define my own conception of timbre, it may be rather different from another conception of a psychologist, for example, who is experimenting on small stimuli. For example, I will not speak of stimuli, but of musical works or pieces. So for me, orchestration is a way to study musical timbre. For me, it's very important to relate timbre to musical context, musical strategies, but I know that we need also to develop knowledge on the other acoustical context, and this can be very interesting. But my point of view, my ideas about future research is like to develop creative aspects how to create a creation of timbre. That's for me a very interesting perspective. And also the idea, we saw a lot of presentation with very small stimuli, or so a sort of atomistic research, and perhaps the other side of this research is also to consider, like during the last session, overall timbres produced by a whole orchestra, and that's the opposite, and perhaps we should try to establish links between these things, but it's not evident, because I'm not so sure if you want to study orchestration. You have very complex, I spoke about complexity. For me, studying musical timbre is a question of complexity. We have a lot of entities, we have a lot of descriptors, and is it possible to isolate one phenomenon? It's difficult because it interrelates with everything. So my idea about further research would be to try to reconcile the research which focuses on small points, and which are very interesting, and these other research who are musically oriented, but who are perhaps a little bit a utopia, because it's difficult to isolate phenomena, and we are using generally qualitative methods. And some kind perhaps of subjectivity, because when we analyze, it's our own analysis, and other experimental studies are much more based on the experimentation with the other listeners, so it's kind of controlled objectivity. And so there are different tendencies, and for me a real interdisciplinary dialogue would be to try to concile all these things. And yes, don't know if I answered the question, but the idea of orchestration is the idea for me of musicality, creation, and studying complex situations, and we have a lot of many interesting points to develop for me in the future.
You're addressing the notion of interdisciplinary research, so you think we need more of that in timbre research, or do we have a sufficient interdisciplinarity? Or?
It depends on what is for you interdisciplinarity. We speak of multidisciplinarity, of interdisciplinarity, of transdisciplinarity. What we want as a kind of dialogue between these disciplines. I remember in Montreal two years ago, but perhaps this edition of a timbre conference was a little bit more marked by the differences between many methodologies which are very specific to scientific culture. According to the sessions, we saw that we are researchers who have different backgrounds, and it's sometimes it can be difficult to follow every types of research. I would like, for example, to develop applications of some interesting things. For example, the question of timbre and musical tension, but I see that it's not evident to develop such an application. I tried in some papers to do that, but it can be interesting, but complicated to create a real interdisciplinarity. But that's a challenge for our community, I guess.
I'm muted.
Can I go back to the question you addressed to Philippe?
Yes, of course.
The role of artificial intelligence. I totally agree with the comments about the outliers. So we're very obsessed with sort of gathering and compartmentalizing the way that, certainly I'm going to use music production as a reference point because that's my thing. we are very sort of keen to compartmentalize and say, well, I always would do this with a compressor. If it was this style of music, I would always do this with an EQ. Quite often, the interesting part in terms of this data is, as you quite rightly said, Philippe, is the outliers here, and often the creativity lies in those points. I guess if I were to counter that, so effectively I'm agreeing but disagreeing, I think the idea of co-creativity, where an AI can suggest something to a musician or a producer or an engineer, which in turn leads to another avenue of creativity, that's where this gets quite interesting. I guess the problem here is your audience. So who are you aiming this technology at? We ran a 5-year research project fusing audio and semantic technologies, FAST, which we ran at Queen Mary. And what we learned from this is that we have 3 very set divisions. We have experts, we have amateurs or hobbyists, but there's this very interesting group in the middle that we call proams. And they're very interesting because in many cases, they don't actually care about the science. They don't care about the technical details. What they want to do is they want to achieve a professional result, but they don't want to have to get involved in science. So quite often, and this really is where our research into the semantics, the descriptors and how we achieve, how we map an emotion or a descriptor to a set of parameters or to a parameter space. And that for me is an interesting place to be. This idea that we're designing technologies for people who in many cases have very little understanding of the process and the workflow. And it occurred to me, I wrote a piece about this, about how many of us use preset technologies, but the irony for me is that they're much safer in the hands of people who can interrogate them and the people that know what to do with them than the very people they were designed for, which is of course the hobbyists and the amateurs. And quite often when I'm observing the way that some of my students work, they use this technology in a very unquestioning way, which arguably could be liberating, but in another sense, I worry, how do they lead up to this point? Is there an inability to interrogate the technology and understand the appropriateness, I guess, of some of it? So I think this is for me, it's a very, very interesting area in music production. And certainly over the next 10 years, I can see there will be far, far more development and certainly thought going into these areas of how these technologies can be used in appropriate, or for that matter, maybe inappropriate ways. But I think it's still very much it's in its infant stages and still underexplored for me.
I completely agree with you on like all the points that relate to what is the use of and that's even another topic. I mean, it's a completely different topic from designing for me, the most interesting way I look at it is that I spend sometimes, nights and weekends working on something and being so proud of having this button works from -3 to +3. And the first thing when a composer comes, he puts it to 4 or 5. And I'm saying, no, you can't use it like this. And it's like really the area where the thing is the most interesting is kind of the failure mode somehow. And of course, as you said, it completely depends on who and why the technology should be used. And I'm very much intrigued by how this is going to unfold in terms of music production, of course, but even for, the whole musical perception field, for instance. So I guess, I don't know, it's always the problem of an era. You don't know where things are going, and one day you wake up and you say, oh, wow, it's been there. So I don't know, for the artificial intelligence, for me, the problem is I don't know if we're going to reach a point where we should adapt our own perception. We should adapt to what the algorithm is telling us. This is the way things are going. And you don't need, as Nathalie said, you know, this atomicist way of thinking, where you just want to have a clear explanation. This is 0.2 times the centroid plus 0.8 times the spectral spread. And you have sometimes not such a clear explanation of how one dimension should behave. And we have to adapt to something in which it kind of overpower our own understanding. So for me, this is the point where it's going to start to be very interesting. But once again, when you talked about pro amateurs, for instance, you know, I've seen people, I did this weird thing called flow synthesizer, where people could, you know, use a synthesizer just using a hand, and it would move all the parameters based on just one dimension or two dimensions. And people would use it in such weird and fucked up ways. I loved it. And at the same time, it made no sense. So we are kind of taking the questions to how much the system should adapt to each person. And I think it's really something that is kind of in the air, I'd say. You know, the subjective music. I don't know how to call it. It's super, super weird. But I guess one evolution of music is that everybody is going to do music at one point. You can see it as how people are now able to access DAW or, you know, synthesizers, and you don't really need to have a scientific background to use sound synthesis now. And you don't need education to do music. I think somehow this part is a good thing, as long as we keep this other stream of outliers, which still try to push inside completely different areas, people that are literate, maybe, I don't know. But maybe for me, the biggest achievement that machine learning can do is to bring music production, at least music creation in some form, to the general public. So everybody can kind of change and morph the music to their own liking. So.
I think, yeah, I really like this perspective. And actually, more or less, Gary went into some topics that I had planned to ask him. So thank you, Gary. That's great. Now we can sort of open, what's the expression? Open the floor? Open the discussion to the floor. Sorry. So we invite anyone from the participants, if you want to raise a question, to bring up a topic, something that you think it's worth discussing. You can, I don't know, you can raise your hand, or you can, we encourage you to now, you know, turn on your cameras, use your microphones. Well, microphones, I guess, with a bit of caution.
I have a general question, if I may, for the panel. It's a question that kind of summarizes across all of these fields the distance that everybody seems to be pointing to between theory and practice. That we believe, on the one hand, that there is this practice of timbre, orchestration, user interfaces, some way of having direct connection to timbre in some sort of creative domain. And on the other hand, we have a body of theorizing or attempts to get at theories. And I wonder if the future isn't finding solutions for bridging this gulf between theory making on the one hand and the practice of making music at whatever level, in whatever genre, using whatever means we have available to us. I wonder if people might, on the panel, like to address that.
Yeah, Mo, I find it very interesting. I mean, it's not only that in practical fields, like really practice, music production or instrument making or fields like that, but even in research practice, like doing psychophysical experiments, for example, we can do really nice timbre experiments, but we also do not really have a general theory. So I would agree that it extends in various fields there.
Yeah, if I may, because I'm super interested in the question. And hello, Mo. Very nice seeing you, by the way. So yeah, I guess it's actually what I just said briefly, calling it the gestural, instrumental gesture of AI, for instance, because we create kind of new instruments. They have their own dimensions. And usually, you know, music production or musical instruments have been linked to a physical process. And now we've deported this physical process to a completely digital and non-tangible area where, you know, you have dimensions and you can't relate them to a physical process. So how do you create something that you can play with where it's just a set of knobs? And it's been like a question that has been bugging me. And I think it's actually even a new field of research in itself, is we really need to create a system to interact with the system. So we have a system that produces the music, but we need a system to understand how do we interact with the system that produced the music. So now this is where I think this is a very subjective and kind of reinforcement learning type of idea, where you can recreate the interaction you want. And for me, it's a very exciting development that music can be thought as an immaterial thing that is not only produced as the result of a physical interaction with an object, right? So for me, I don't have a clear answer. I just have another question, which is, should we even question the way we interact with technology as being another field for machine learning, maybe, or for anything, in which the instrumental gesture is kind of absent? And how do we address this instrumental gesture of digital technologies?
So shall I try to offer something here?
Yeah.
So I kind of started in the analog era with a mixing console and tape machines. And it occurs to me that we're still very locked into the traditional paradigms. We still use those as our metaphors and our reference points. And we see it with kind of plug-in technology. And actually, it's very interesting, for me, this whole transition from analog to digital, in terms of, it seems like they have completely different motivations. And I'll give you a couple of real world examples in a minute. With analog, for me, it was all about kind of this approximating perfection, whereas with digital technology, it's very much about trying to perfect approximation. So we're trying to look back and we're trying to model a lot of these technologies rather than treating them as new tools and kind of looking forward. And I think in many ways that's kind of held us back. And probably for me, what I have to do periodically is just throw away the technology that I use and use something new. Otherwise, I will repeat those patterns. I guess the thing I was going to talk about a moment ago was the fact that I'm continually asked when I mix something to make it sound like something. So this is very relevant to our discussion about timbre. So because it's very much connected to style for me, and please correct me if someone disagrees. So I'm asked to do something where maybe, could you make this vocal sound more pillowy? I mean, what the hell is pillowy? And I think, okay, so pillowy, I'll compress it and I'll use an opto compressor because it has a very fast attack and a very slow release. And therefore it will even out the transients. And then someone will say to me, yeah, that's exactly what I was talking about. Or they'll say, no, I completely got it wrong. So this, once again, coming back to this idea of appropriateness, seems to me quite sort of problematic in the way that we select sort of certain pieces of technology from our past, and we fail to kind of allow them to kind of go through this natural evolution that maybe they should do. And I think it's kind of this anti-progressive attitude in music production in many ways has really hindered us. And I definitely have to throw curved balls literally at my workflow to force me to think about things in new ways where we're very much locked into certain paradigms, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I think I would pick up on that. And you know, I can see like a thread between, let's say, the more traditional orchestration analysis, let's say represented by Nathalie in the panel, then, you know, the audio engineering, music production perspective, and then synthesizers, and how Philippe very nicely put it, among the kind of the sound of today, right? So it seems to me that one way forward might be, you know, we've spent decades looking at isolated sounds, right? Understanding how we perceive timbre, what timbre is and what we can do with it through studying isolated notes. And this has a great value in itself. But for example, the work that Gary does and other people in audio engineering, and how effects shape sounds, and not only isolated sounds, but exactly, right? So a musician comes to you and says, I want you to make my sound, or I want you to make this particular album sound like that. Probably Philippe might be getting similar suggestions from the composers that he works with. And then maybe in more classical music, can we say that there is a specific sound for Beethoven versus Mozart versus, you know, it doesn't have to be individual composers. It could be, you know, the sound of the Baroque orchestra or the sound of the Romantic orchestra. And there we see some sort of blending of the notion of sound and the notion of timbre. That's, I think, something that could be a point to address in the coming years. Say something.
So I think we have roughly 10 minutes left in our time frame. We can, of course, extend as long as we wish. We do have a question from the audience. From Juan, and it goes like, thinking about theory related to practice, I'm wondering about musical education on early stages, specifically ear training. What could be already clear or wide discussed about timbre and its perception that could be condensed and taught into those stages, right? So do we have, or do we need timbral ear training?
Almost certainly. So actually, it's a great study by Josh Rice with, I know it's not totally related to this, but in a weird way it is, on high-res audio, where he had, I think it was 3,000 participants for this study. And it was basically, he was trying to find out if people would hear the difference between audio 16-bit 44.1 and 24-bit 96K, which of course we have this debate every day, don't we? And he ran the initial study, and it was really, the results were very random and didn't really show anything. So then what he did was he took, I think it was 10%, 300 of those participants, and he trained them what to listen for. And then the results became very significant. So I think there is definitely an argument for technical ear training. And I certainly encourage it with my students. Absolutely.
No, definitely. I mean, a lot of like fundamental research on timbre perception is based on musicians and musically, you know, this very infamous phrase we see on papers. We even use it ourselves. Musically experienced listeners participated in this study, and you know, I often people, ask me about my research, and then as soon as I mention the term timbre in laymen, like in people that have they're not musicians, they have no particular context with any of the music or sound related fields, they don't necessarily know the term or understand it. It is indeed true that there are some studies now that show that if you train the people, you get a difference. Like you can learn to hear, and that's actually what Cornelia Fales claims in her chapter in that in the book the Pursuit of Tone. This popular music studies book that was published a couple of years ago. I think it was launched in the Montreal Timbre Conference. So she claims, for example, that she studies the blogs in the forums in the EDM community in California, and she develops a theory that these listeners underwent some sort of perceptual training. So they learned to hear, to pay attention to timbres, to sounds, to textures, as opposed to melody and harmony. So this is entirely possible, and we definitely need that.
I completely agree, if I may continue, because I like very much where this is going. And I think we have even historical type of examples. I mean, I don't know if it translates to concrete music, musique concrète, which is in French, musique concrète, right? Which means like Pierre Schaeffer and all these things where it was like trains, and trains are not music, but yet they are music now. And the same goes with electronic music. I guess that depending on the era where you were born, you can consider different thing musical. So let's put aside like temporality and how, Schaeffer questioned the way sounds were organized in time. And I don't know if you've seen this funny video, I love it. It's one of the first demonstration of the Moog synthesizer by Bob Moog. And it just played one of this system inside a big concert hall, and you can see children crying, actually. And it's kind of a weird scene where it's just playing this huge modular synthesizer and it's creating weird sounds, and everybody in the room is just completely shocked. Like, what's going on? What is this thing? And of course, it goes without saying that it depends on how you were born and where you were born, and we have different education. And I guess, of course, we can always expand. I don't know if I will be able to listen to all the sounds in the universe. I hope so. But maybe, I don't know if there is a proper education of timbre in itself. It's really a long time, but oh wow, I've just seen a comment. Speakers of some click language can distinguish 140 sounds in the speed of speaking. So that's a very good example. So it's basically, it's almost an ethnomusicological argument, depending on the era and where you were born. Of course, the training is part of, how you can understand stuff. And I don't know if there is a proper education, but at least I hope there is some way of expanding the musical horizon through this.
Yeah, I wonder, actually, I'm thinking these days about what people 40,000 years ago must have thought when they first heard flutes, right? The first flutes that have been found, for example, at the Swabian Alps. Nicolas Cornard dig them there, and it must be so amazing to I find this idea amazing to think you're this human being living during the Ice Age, and then you come to this cave and you, for the first time, you hear a flute. I don't know, some sort of the birth of timbre perception in some sense.
Yes, if I may, also about education, the question of education, it seems to me that timbre is perhaps has a potential to make links between different cultures. For example, in general education, it can be more easy to teach without score-based methods, and I guess that timbre aspect can be interesting for people who do not read music, or it's a way to teach music, but not with scores and notes and notation. But it's also very interesting for studying score-based music and following, for example, François Delalande. He speaks about the music beyond the notes. So for the musicians, it's the music beyond the notes of the score, and it can also touch other cultures. So for general education, or so it seems to me a promising parameter, because music has it was often a specialized discipline, and perhaps difficult to teach because of a specific notation. But with timbre, we do not have these limitations. So the possibilities are that there is a real potential for me to perhaps to touch a general public and also musicians. So.
Okay, I really like where this discussion has gone, but we only have a few minutes left. So I was wondering whether somebody else has something from the audience, has something to add or to ask. Or from the panelists, of course.
One thing real quick, I just really want to thank everyone for all the interdisciplinary connections. Building kind of what Nathalie said earlier, I think interdisciplinary connections are kind of difficult to build, and I think there's a lot of people doing really hard work trying to make that happen, especially between the kind of large scale looks at pieces and scale stimuli and things like that. I think there's a lot of really cool work going on. So just thanks to everyone for that.
Thank you, Braden.
Has a question, I think.
Yeah, I kind of have a question to sort of add to the.
And then Professor McAdams next. Go on, Cyrus.
Yeah, kind of adding to the existing discussion around AI and extrapolation of timbre. So obviously, core to modern electronic music is our ability to create wild timbres through transforming sounds with effects. For example, I could take a field recording of some bird sounds and pass this through a resonator and create timbres I've never heard before. And throughout this conference, we've seen studies on synthesized timbres from sound synthesizers, from acoustic physical bodies, bird sounds, vocal timbre. So these are all timbre in their own right and are encoded as timbre perceptually. So how can we go towards sort of unified spaces or generalized spaces for timbres, where perhaps in music production we can explore timbre in this more general sense, not just in terms of acoustic sounds or generalization of acoustic sounds, or in terms of controlling sound synthesizers which already have very particular constraints in the timbres they can produce.
Yeah, can I answer? Or
yeah, very much so.
Okay. I mean, that's a very peculiar question you're asking, because somehow you're referring to synthesizers, and synthesizers, they have this a kind of world of possibilities, and extrapolation means you go beyond what is possible with something. And interpolation means you go across known manifold of information. And for me, this is a very peculiar question, because when you talk about general time or space, you have this kind of, I see this as some islands. You know, you have islands of information. So you have islands where you know what's going on in this island and what's going on in this island. And it's kind of a probability mass. You know, you have different mass of probabilities between, for instance, let's say you have like techno music and you have Beethoven. And what's going on between the island of Beethoven and techno music? Can you do something in this area where the probability is very low, but you know something exists? And the problem is, in the way AI right now organize information, this is where it fails. It fails a lot when you have like a huge distance between very probable space, but each space is probable in its own right. So you can create one very probable space of Beethoven music, for instance, and you can create a very probable space of techno music. But then the in-between is where the extrapolation lies. Because even though it can be interpreted as interpolation, it's still such a low probability event that you are creating something in its own right. So for me, I'm not sure we can aim for general time or space, right? Where we can really span the whole perceptual area that exists. But we could at least try to map out an intersection. And for me, this is a very intense kind of field where you could mix the different technologies, because there is one technology which is good at mapping out these spaces, and another which is good as you know, creating something from parameters. I don't know if I'm very clear now, so I'm going to try to be a little bit more scientific. You have the machine learning approach, which kind of takes complex information and summarize it in this probable space. And then you have these functional approaches, which are rule-based and create sound out of known rules. And for me, the hybrid approach, where you have machine learning mapping out spaces of information and then using this functional type of approach to go outside of the probable space, is, I don't know, maybe it's a failed answer, because you know, when a scientist tells you that something is not possible, it's most certainly possible. But I guess if we could mix the learning approach with a very functional synthesis approach, this is where we could extrapolate and get, you know, the whole space.
Stephen's turn.
Yep. Thanks, Philippe.
Okay, well, thanks. Listen, I always want to say this has been a fantastic conference, and we want to thank, everybody wants to thank Kai and Haris and Asteris for this really wonderful event. One of the things I noticed is that a lot of the questions we raised 2 years ago are still relevant, and there's been a lot of progress on them, so that's very encouraging. But there's a lot of new questions that are arising as well, which that's good. That means that it's actually taking form as a field and is generating new conversations, new dialogues, and new methods and so on. So I think that's really exciting. But there's also one thing that I'm finding interesting is this, there's a lot stronger focus on, less on what timbre is, and we're getting past that finally, and what we can do with timbre, whether it's actually syntactic or structural or has its own internal logic or whatever. But I think the whole thing is very, very encouraging to me. And so I really just want to thank you guys for a really fantastic job in bringing us all together.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you,
Stephen. We have another raise.
We finalize with Claudia then.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I comment just quickly on what Steve just said? I mean, it's gonna be super quick, but I love the question of how we move past from why and to the how. It's kind of a transition to not forcibly understanding every dimension. And I think this is very resonant with what we said and what actually Gary said, and also Nathalie, on how we can use something, I mean, use concepts that we don't fully grasp. And for me, this is a real direction of research, because this is really what I see right now in the machine learning community. It's kind of, we have these huge transforms and they do stuff. We don't understand why it works, but it works. And somehow I feel like Timbre is a really nice study, let's say, observation deck, where you can have this question of how we can use these things that we don't understand. So
it's an interesting analogy between machine learning and Timbre research.
Yeah.
We still have to try to understand, though.
So that means we'll be really successful, we'll change the world, but we'll never understand it. No? I don't know.
Exactly.
We have another comment by Claudia Fritz.
I can't start my video because you stopped it.
Let me try.
Yeah, my remark was a bit more general. I've been concerned about climate change for years, and so I've tried to reduce my flight and so on. And there were one thing in my job where I was thinking, how can I do without conferences? And I really believe from long ago that we could do a lot of work, through web meetings and at a smaller scale. But now I realize that actually even conferences can be organized fully online and being very enjoyable. And so it's not at all, not exactly the same as meeting in person, but it's much, much, much better than I thought it would be, because I still felt not that far away from everybody. The musical interludes were amazing, even if I was able to connect my computer to my hi-fi system, so I had good audio quality, so it was quite nice. And yeah, and even the social gathering last night, I think Town Gather is a nice tool and actually allow you to interact. And so I think that's, you are probably pioneering here something by doing fully online, and I suppose we should continue just to save our planet. So maybe finding a pattern, or maybe 1 every 2 conferences, because I think it's still nice to meet in person, but maybe 1 every 2 could be fully online, and the other one could be, yeah. So if we all save a bit in terms of traveling, that would be very nice. So thanks for this amazing organization. It worked very well.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Claudia. You're welcome.
It's an appropriate remark to wrap it all up.
One suggestion would be to try to challenge Zoom a little bit, and so every one of the remaining 46 participants just to switch on their cameras, perhaps also their sounds. That will be a lot of fun. Perhaps we'll get it crashing.
No, it will not crash. It will not.
Yes. Otherwise,
Zoom is pretty solid.
Let's have a cocktail party effect. Everybody start talking.
Perhaps we get some resonances going on.
That's nice.
Then we can take a group photo. We can take a group photo.
A group photo, yes. Yes, a group photo.
Photo, very good idea.
With a mosaic.
Great conference.
Wow. It's not crashing.
No.
Working.
So we might like to keep our cameras open while we listen to our last musical live show. So our musicians are eager to play one last bit of music for us to say goodbye. And this time Nikos will be joined by Martina on the piano. So we have a duo. From our side in Thessaloniki, we would like to thank you very much for participating. We enjoyed it. We of course would like to have welcomed you physically here, but that would probably mean we would be less of us. So now we're more of us, and that's a good thing. So thanks very much. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. And let's try to make this a periodical thing.
look forward